We're going to be talking with Jonathan Haidt. He has just written a bombshell of a piece in The Atlantic called Why the Past 10 Years of American Life Have Been Uniquely Stupid.
Fewer than 10% of those who are dominating social media on the left and the right are coming from extreme places, but about 50 to 70% of what is shared and amplified virally on the social media is coming from the kind of extreme quadrants.
Something's going wrong with our institutions. To find truth, you must have viewpoint diversity and people engaging with each other, questioning each other, challenging each other's confirmation bias. If you can make one single change that would have the biggest impact, I believe it's open primaries.
Everybody on this Zoom is very passionate about political reform, redistricting, ranked choice, open primaries. How do we build our movement and pursue our goals without falling into the same trap that the tech utopians did?
We have to try things. As Franklin Roosevelt did early in the Depression, we have to just try things because we don't know what's going to work. And be humble about what will work. And also be courageous. Be courageous. I think the last few years people got very afraid, but I think we're coming out of that period.
So it's great to have such good turnout in the dog days of August. I'm very excited about this conversation with Jonathan today. My co-host, Jeff Bewkes, is a longtime friend. He's been a very successful professional in the media world. He ran HBO in the 1990s and went on to become the CEO and president of Time Warner. He's a board member at the Brookings Institute and has just been a longtime supporter of independent and reform projects and initiatives. So Jeff, thank you so much for taking time to help us have this conversation.
Good to be here.
We're going to be talking with Jonathan Haidt today. Jonathan, I guarantee everybody knows him already, but by way of introduction to our live stream listeners and watchers, Jonathan is one of the country's most prominent and esteemed social psychologists. He's at the Stern School of Business at NYU, where he is a professor of ethical leadership. He has just written a bombshell of a piece in The Atlantic that we're here to talk about today called Why the Past 10 Years of American Life Have Been Uniquely Stupid. Great title. And Jonathan, say hello. And before we get into the conversation, I actually want to show a quick clip of an interview you gave on Morning Joe a while back.
Okay. Hello. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Great. Let's take a look at this clip.
So how did we get to the point where such a small group of people wielded so much power online?
Yeah. So first, it's not one small group of people, it's 4 small groups of people. So Mark Zuckerberg often says, how could it be wrong to give more people more voice? Now that sounds good if you're going to elevate everyone, or especially elevate those who don't have voice. And back in the early 2010s, that's what we thought social media was going to do. There was a period where we thought, this is the best thing for democracy. Autocracy can't possibly withstand connected citizens. And that reached a pinnacle around 2011, 2012. But what happened after that, after social media got much more hyper-viralized, it wasn't like that in the early days. Once it became much more like you can shoot darts, things go viral. Once that happened, 4 groups really picked up the guns. 4 groups used them powerfully. It is the far right, the far left, trolls, who are always men, not women, they're always men who enjoy harassing people and get prestige from it or some sort of thrill, and Russian agents who have been expert at this, and they really kicked in their campaign in 2014. So not that it's mostly their fault at all, I'm just saying 4 groups really started going crazy and shooting us and intimidating people, and that's when our institutions get structurally stupid. It wasn't like this in 2012. If you graduated from college in 2012, you didn't see any of this stuff. But you talk to students now, and it's like they self-censor, they're afraid of being ripped to shreds. So that's where we are now.
Wow. So, John, tell us how, as a social psychologist, how did you get interested in this topic of social media? What's the central premise of your piece, and what did you discover in the process of writing it?
Yeah. Well, so I got interested in it because I've been a professor since 1995. I love being a professor. I love universities. And all of a sudden in 2014, 2015, something changed. There was a glitch in the fabric of space-time in universities.
Huh.
And suddenly all this weird stuff was happening. Students were asking for trigger warnings, safe spaces, microaggression stuff. And people started becoming afraid of students, of a small number of students. And administrators began doing weird self-destructive things. And so the country watched as a lot of our universities kind of went insane and became laughing stocks. And this really was picked up by right-wing media that they had all kinds of sections on campus craziness. And at first we thought it was just something about universities. But then similar stuff started happening in journalism, in the arts and museums, in some portions of corporate America and some parts of tech. So weird stuff has been happening, and something's going wrong with our institutions, especially our epistemic institutions, that is, those that are tasked with finding truth. To find truth, you must have viewpoint diversity and people engaging with each other, questioning each other, challenging each other's confirmation bias. And that started declining, that started going away sometime in the 2010s, even just before Trump was elected. Trump exacerbated things, but he didn't cause this. This problem began just before Trump. And so I watched as many of our institutions sort of collapsed from the inside and lost the trust of people. You can't have a democracy, especially American democracy. We don't have a king or some sort of religious thing binding us together. We're based on our institutions and our shared stories. And I gradually began to see that social media shredded any capacity for shared stories. We can no longer have shared stories. We may never again have shared stories in this country. Social media undercut our institutions, and it made people afraid of each other. And so I finally put it all together when I always think about metaphors, and I came across the Tower of Babel metaphor, that the story in Genesis, and the key line where God says, "Let us go down and confound their language, so that they may not understand one another." And I realized, wow, that's the metaphor. That is what has happened to us. Social media has connected us all in ways that make us unable to understand each other. So that's what led to the Atlantic article.
Got it. Talk more about you mentioned two things, that it's this shared stories and it's shared institutions. When you think about the way I think about America is that we're this 300-year experiment with self-government.
Yeah.
Self-governing. Is that the same as self-governing? Strong institutions and shared stories? Is it a broader lens? Is this a particularly important part of that picture, or is it the whole picture? Mm-hmm. How do you think about the whole question of self-governing?
Yeah, so two ways. A big one contributor to this problem, which we're not going to talk about beyond this moment, is just that we stopped our kids from learning about self-governance in the 1990s. Children always went out to play unsupervised. During the crime wave, there was a long crime wave, 30 years, kids went out to play. In the 90s, we stopped that. We freaked out, I think, because of stories on cable TV about the occasional abduction, which almost never happens. But we stopped letting kids out to play, and now we're surprised that kids have no idea how to self-govern. They come to college and they can't resolve a little verbal conflict. They have to go to a dean. That's part of what made us all afraid, that they were reporting us right and left for verbal transactions. So that's one thing, is we've utterly messed up Gen Z. Kids born after 1995, we've utterly messed them up. We've doubled their rate of depression, anxiety, self-harm, and suicide. So that's one piece. That has to be resolved, but that has nothing to do with open primaries. That has to do with parenting and laws that make parents afraid of letting their kids outside. They could be arrested for it. So that's one piece. The other piece, I'm just beginning to read Gershberg and Illig. They have a new book, The Paradox of Democracy. It's really good. The introductory chapter is really mind-blowing. And they make the argument that a democracy is not primarily a set of institutions and practices like voting. It's primarily a discourse culture based on persuasion. To have democracy, you have to have some way that people put ideas out and interact with each other and somehow persuade enough that they vote for something. And those that lose agree, okay, I lost this round, but I'm going to try to argue in the future for. So you have to have a culture of persuasion. And that's what we always had in universities from about maybe 400 BC to about 2015. That's what we had, with some gaps in between. But beginning after 2015, we don't have that. I mean, I'm exaggerating. Of course, we have it in many places. But you can't talk about anything controversial anymore because you'll be reported, you'll get in big trouble on social media, and we live in fear. So democracy as self-governance requires a culture of persuasion. The technological environment determines how we interact. And so the era of mass media was not very democratic, but we were all on the same page. We all had, whether it was 3 networks originally, or 5, or even when it was 100, it was still, there was some possibility that people would hear the same story or come to believe the same thing. Like after 9/11, we largely agreed that we were attacked by Al-Qaeda, other than some fringe theories. But that may be the last time that we come to agreement on a big thing that happened. I don't think we didn't do that on COVID. I don't think we'd be able to do that if anything like that happens again. So the technology has made it hard for us to come to any agreement or persuade each other.
John, can I jump in? So I think that's pretty clear what you're saying about how in the academy and the media and the corporations, people have become afraid of certain discourse and it's chilled it. And essentially, as you said, I think you said that leaders in the university are have become afraid of the students because of the students' in exposure to certain experiences that you just described we used to have. In the government sector, I think we currently, without becoming partisan, are watching one of the parties in the United States be very afraid in its the leaders of the Republican Party, of its base, who one could argue, I would think that, but it's a matter of opinion, the base being somewhat uninformed. It hasn't yet been the same in the Democratic Party. Do you have any views as to why it is more either happening first on the right or the right is more prone to it because of?
Yes, I do. No, that's a very good observation about the asymmetry. This is one of the probably the most important point in my, or one of the most important points in my Atlantic article, and it's one that amazingly I didn't get in any trouble for. That is, nobody really objected to this. What I said was, there's been an asymmetry where we have structural stupidity in many parts. Structural stupidity means a group or organization loses the ability to discuss, debate, and reach reasoned conclusions because people are afraid. And I said, we have one structurally stupid party, and it is the Republican Party. The Republican Party has gotten rid of its moderates. They don't really have debates over things that they ought to be debating. And it's out of that same kind of fear that you just mentioned. And so there are many reasons for why the Republican Party has become the stupid party. Primarily, I think Fox News began a culture that the right-wing TV was much more important and powerful in feedback loops for the Republicans than it was for the Democrats. The Democrats are not the stupid party. They have moderates and extremes, and the moderates win most of the debates. But especially for those who are not Democrats on the call, just wait a second, because what I said was there's an asymmetry. When you look at the cultural institutions, most of our cultural institutions are dominated by the left, and that's where you see the structural stupidity of the left. It's not the Democratic Party. That's a functioning center-left party. And we saw in the last week or two, they actually got some real big stuff done. But if you look at almost any organization that is overwhelmingly left, and here I point again to universities, K-12 education schools, teachers' colleges, the media, journalism, most of the organizations that tell our stories and educate our children, pretty much all of them are dominated by people on the left, which isn't necessarily a problem. But as I said before, around 2015, a mania took over, a fear took over, and they began to all fail systemically in their ability to process truth, and they all became structurally stupid. And you can't have a country in which we have one party is structurally stupid, and we have most of our epistemic institutions are structurally stupid, and then people on each side can legitimately point to the stupidity on the other side. Democrats say, look at the Republican Party. They're so horrible that, anything we do is justified because they're so horrible. But people on the right, they don't point to the Democratic Party. They say, look what they're doing in our schools. Look what they're doing, in all these social policies that are driving us all crazy. So yeah, we're in big trouble because we have this huge asymmetry and we're surrounded by structural stupidity.
This is probably a whole nother hour-long conversation, John, about that asymmetry and about the ways in which the stupidity of the institutions looks different. It doesn't look all the same. One of the things I experience is that the Democratic Party is not the same as the Republican Party in all the ways that you point out, but they're equally committed to a very uncreative political culture. And again, I do not think they are the same, and they're going through different struggles,
Yeah.
and they have different strengths and weaknesses. But taken as a whole, the two parties are stifling creative political expression in this country.
I agree.
In some very significant ways. And it makes me, so you wrote this piece with Catherine Gale in Time Magazine of just a few months before the Atlantic piece about Final Five voting. Do you see kind of a relationship between this kind of expansion of the political environment and dealing with some of this weaponization of social media? I don't want to put them together if they're not, but how do you see that?
Sure. Yeah, so I think the way to understand this is to see rising what's called affective polarization. So there are many ways to measure polarization, but one measure is how much do you hate or fear people on the other side? And those numbers were pretty flat in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. Most Americans, if you're Republican, you didn't like the Democrats, but you didn't hate them. On average, this is across all voters. But beginning in the very late 90s and then throughout the 21st century, affective polarization goes up and up and up, and it's continued to go up. And that's very dangerous because international research shows that in a country where people are highly affectively polarized, that they feel like they can justify anything, even at undemocratic actions. So you see this all over the world. Violence is justified because the other side is so horrible and hateful and dangerous that if they win the election, it's the Flight 93 election. It's like everything's over. So we can do anything to stop them, and that would be ethical. That would be patriotic even. So as polarization goes up, a lot of our democratic institutions have begun to malfunction. Now, we have this ridiculous, stupid institution called the closed party primary. As far as I know, we're the only major country that does this,
Right.
that has each party has their own nominating contest. Now, when things weren't terribly polarized, that kind of worked. And also when there were party bosses, Jonathan Rauch has written a lot about this. So you had back rooms, smoke-filled rooms, you had the parties picking who should we put up to run. Okay, so that was it. That, you could say that's undemocratic, but it kind of worked. When that faded away and it became truly primaries, like really open, primaries only open to the voters in one party, now who votes? It's the most angry people, it's the most partisan people. So this, so my analysis here is that there's a gigantic systemic problem. Open primaries isn't going to fix the problem. But what I've long said, once I learned about it, is that if you can make one single change that would have the biggest impact, I believe it's open primaries. Now, I'm with Catherine Gale that I think Final Five is best, but I think we don't know. We have to, my friend Mickey Edwards, who I greatly respect, insists, no, the voters have to pick between two people. You have to have a choice between two. My view is we need experiments. We need to see, how's it going to work in Alaska? How has it worked elsewhere? This is not going to be a magic bullet, but I think it's the single worst part of our nominating system. And the point when I was talking with Catherine, what really got me was this. Everybody acts like the point of open primaries is to change who gets elected.
Right.
Okay. And that's part of it. That's part of it. You want more moderates elected, or at least you don't want the extremists, the crazies elected. But what really got me to be a fan is how do they behave after they're elected? And this we hear more and more about. 80% of the elections in the House, as I understand it, are not competitive. They don't actually matter. All that matters is the primary. So Congress people only have an incentive to win the primary, which means nothing is to be gained by working with the other side. It's all down. It's all downside because you'll get pilloried on social media and cable TV. So the primary, I think, is the single biggest. The closed party primary is the single biggest obstacle. I'll just make one final point about what really got me is suppose you're a Democrat and you're undecided about whether you want open primaries, and you're thinking about who would win on the Democratic side. Okay. Don't think about that. Think for a moment, what kind of Republicans do you want to win? Do you want completely crazy, bonkers Republicans who believe in crazy conspiracy theories? Is that who you want to win the Republican primary? Or do you want a process on the Republican side that will actually weed out the crazies and incentivize people who are more moderate, more able to work together? And then, of course, the same calculation goes in reverse.
It's a great piece, your Time Magazine piece. Jeff, did you want to jump
maybe
in?
Russell, can you put the link to it in the chat?
While we've been talking, I've been monitoring some of the group chat, and I know we're going to get to questions, so I'm just reassuring everybody that we'll have half an hour. For those who think that statements being made already aren't right, can ask about that and maybe either get the statements, get an open debate, which is what we're arguing for. Should we go to social media and how some of the extreme voices, we just kind of did it on the primary side, but in social media, why would the extreme voices, which I think, John, in your work are less than 10, fewer than 10% of those who are dominating social media on the left and the right, are coming from extreme places, but about 50 to 70% of what is shared and amplified virally on the social media is coming from the kind of extreme quadrants. Can you talk about that to discuss how people get informed? Because that just feeds into the political problem.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, so in the age of mass media, there were editors who decided what stories would go out, and then we would watch them all at the same time. And then TiVo came along. We didn't watch them at the same time, but we watched them a few hours later. But we were all sort of on the same page to some extent. Now, social media in some ways seems like it should be an advance. You know, as Mark Zuckerberg says, how could it be wrong to give more people more voice? But the problem, as I said in that Morning Joe clip, is that the new megaphones were not used evenly by the population. So if you think about, like, what's the distribution of voices? Before social media, it's always been the case that the people in the middle, the people who are more moderate, they're not as upset, they're not as angry, they're not as energized usually. So they speak up less, they don't push as hard. So you always have the extremes have more voice than the middle 50 to 80%. That's always been the case. When social media, so it comes out in 2004, but it's not polarizing. You put up pictures of your dogs and cats and children. It's 2009 to 2012. That's the key period that I focus on, because that's when Facebook adds the like button and Twitter copies it. Twitter adds the retweet button, which is super powerful. And now anyone can get anything out, especially if it's outrageous. The more outrageous and anger producing it is, the more likely it is to go viral. So we have a sort of an operant or behaviorist conditioning mechanism training people on Twitter, training them on how to be the most outrageous, rage-inducing possible. So it's 2009 to 2012 is the period where everything changes. And that's why the 2010s have been so catastrophic, I believe, from a democratic perspective.
And it's literally just that retweet, repost, share, like that architecture of social media totally transformed it?
That's right. That's right. So if you think about, there's a funny case, many have heard of, what was her name? The woman who tweeted a joke about when she was going to South Africa, and the entire world was calling her a racist. The entire world was, in on the fact that she's in big trouble. And then when she landed, she was then fired very soon after she landed. So that was 2013. That could not have happened in 2008. So that sort of thing could not have happened in 2008. The mob dynamics that we now take for granted was not possible before the retweet button. So the retweet button really changed our social systems, our social structure. And I think without the retweet button, we would not have had the structural stupidity that we had in universities. We all became afraid of whoever was most willing to make accusations. So
just a sidebar, just for your so you know about this, John. I read recently a study out of the Morrison Institute at ASU that looked at, it actually studied the social media networks of Democrats, Republicans, and independents. And they actually found that independent voters, not surprisingly, but no one had quantified this, they actually tend to have more heterodox networks. They actually whereas partisans on both sides tend to talk to partisans, independents kind of play this bridge role. And, I'm just wondering, not that we have to solve all this now, but if there's ways to think about kind of harnessing this growing segment of the electorate that doesn't want to be in either party to kind of engage some of these things as well.
That's right. So what we have to think about here is changing the architecture and the incentives. So in my Atlantic article, I ended it by saying there are 3 reform imperatives. The first is to harden or reform our democratic institutions so they can still function with rising polarization and rising political violence. I think it's very likely we're going to have a lot more assassinations and bombings and groups attacking critical infrastructure, as we had in the late 60s and 70s, and as they have in some Latin American democracies.
Next 5 years, and so we have
for that kind of environment. The second one is we have to reform social media so that it's less toxic to our democratic institutions. And the most important way to do that is to give more voice to people in the middle 80% and less voice, or at least turn down their megaphones, turn the volume down on their megaphones on the far right and the far left. The degree to which people are afraid to speak up, when people are afraid to speak up, that's mostly the middle 80%. We've got to encourage them to speak up, make them less fearful of being canceled, destroyed, shamed, attacked. And now, of course, we're moving into an era in which people are just doing their job. Now people will use social media to dox them. And now you start getting threats to your children and your spouse. You get people coming to your home. So this is terrifying for a democracy that depends on citizens doing their part. Now the degree to which we have intimidation coming in, always, social media is always involved. I don't think we could survive that.
Can we talk a second about concrete things, which would be, if we're going to get people, less extreme domination of these social media things and more from a wider group of people, where Frances Haugen, who was the Facebook whistleblower who worked in there, she argued the one solution, because she knew how Facebook worked. They don't want to fix this, what you're saying, the retweet or the share button, because they make a lot of money when they let bots retweet a lot of things and they sell a lot of advertising, because anger stimulates ad revenue. So they're incentivized the other way. And if you were going to get them to do it, her idea was, and I don't know why they would adopt it, just take the share button, and once you've shared with two shares, then somebody out there has to reshare, so it's not just one action that sends it out to millions of people. Another one both of you have said, and I think this may be where you're going, is verification, so that anonymous people can't grab a microphone and say a bunch of things that are false, defamatory, or inciting. What would you, A, what do you think about that? And B, how do you get, what would cause any of these profit-making companies to do it?
Sure. So first, the things like changing how many people can share an article, those are small architectural changes that add a little bit of friction. Those things are nice. We should think about that, but those are small. Requiring user authentication is a much bigger thing. And here, let me be very, very clear. I'm not saying you have to use your real name. What I'm saying is, in order to open, let's suppose everybody could open an account at Facebook or Twitter, wherever they want. You can open an account under any name and you can see what's going on. But before you have the right to post something on this platform that gives you super viral powers to reach the world, before you post, you have to get authenticated as a real human being in a particular country. And I think we have to be doing age verification. The only way to save the next generation of kids after Gen Z is to keep them off of these really horrible platforms. So user authentication just means before you get the right to post, you have to prove, maybe not to Facebook, maybe it's out to a third party, a nonprofit, that you are somebody, you have a name, and you're old enough. And then they kick back to Facebook to say, yep, this person's authenticated. Now they can post under a fake name. That would remove a lot of the trolls. It would make it harder for the Russians, harder for trolls who create hundreds of accounts and use them to make death threats and rape threats. So authentication would be very powerful. But ultimately, what really we have to be thinking about here is not like tweaks to architecture. It's the kinds of business models that got us into this. So the iPhone is the most incredible Swiss Army knife ever invented. It is our servant. We have apps on it and they serve us. We enjoy those apps. They make our lives better. But there are some apps that are social media apps whose business model is that we are not the customer. They are not motivated to please us. We are the product, and they make their money from engagement. So it's engagement-based business models. That's what's bringing down our democracy, I believe. So right now it's Facebook and Twitter and a few others are the big ones. But even if if they could be sued out of existence, others would arise. So there needs to be some regulatory fix, I believe, that makes it very hard to have a purely engagement-based business model. And if we're going to have them, for God's sakes, we've got to keep kids off of them because these are horrible for everyone's mental health.
John, I want to ask you a philosophical question. And actually, I want to actually seek your advice. And then I want to open it up. We have a lot of questions to get to, so I'll keep this quick. One of the things you and Coleman Hughes talked about in his podcast recently was it's not like Facebook and Twitter set out to destroy the world.
No,
there was this kind of Zuckerberg, this is going to enable democracy. And you talk about the kind of the tech utopianism that was behind the creation and the kind of the further development of these platforms. So everybody on this Zoom is very passionate about political reform, redistricting, ranked choice, open primaries. How do we build our movement and pursue our goals without falling into the same trap that the tech utopians did? How do we not end up in that kind of bubble as we pursue this? Any advice?
Sure. Well, first, avoid structural stupidity. And what that means is be sure that you have a culture of persuasion where no one is afraid for their lives or the reputation, I should say, to dissent, where you encourage dissent. So a public context where you're talking and anyone can chime in, like on Twitter, is basically having discussions in the middle of the Roman Forum, where the stands are full of fans who paid to see blood. That's what they're there for. So don't have conversations in very public fora. Now this is pretty big. We got 255 participants, but I'm not afraid of nasty. If someone makes a nasty comment in the chat, I'm not reading it. But that's not going to intimidate. So that's not a problem. So if you have your discussions in places where everyone really feels psychological safety, you could say, to participate, then you don't have to worry about becoming stupid as has happened on the extremes. Humility to recognize that we're dealing with complex dynamical systems. This is not a complicated clock where there's a gear broken. This is a complex dynamical system like the weather or the economy, and there is no fix for it. There are parameters we can change that will make things better. But we have to really understand, even if you're a fan of ranked choice voting or final five voting or any of these, it's going to sometimes backfire. We have to really be humble about what will work, and we have to try things. As Franklin Roosevelt did early in the Depression, we have to just try things because we don't know what's going to work. And what I can tell you, what I've been shocked by, is how the social science community is not really able to adjudicate these things, even whether social media is harmful for teen mental health. I think the data is very clear. There's some who argue with me, who insist on reading it one way, and they say, oh, it's trivial. So we can't even look to social scientists to help us figure out. I mean, we can help, but you can't look to us to resolve what's going to work. So I would say make sure you have a good culture of persuasion. That's how you get smart. Read John Stuart Mill's On Liberty, the second chapter, and be humble about what will work. And also be courageous. Be courageous. I think the last few years people got very afraid, but I think we're coming out of that period. I mean, when Trump was president, and then under, in the year after George Floyd, I think there was an extraordinary amount of fear of saying anything. But I think people are coming out of the bunker now, and it's a little safer, I think.
Thank you. I like that combination of courage and being humble.
Humility.
Courage and humility. That seems like an important combination. All right, we have a lot of questions. I'm going to open it up. We're going to start in the United Kingdom with John Sinclair, who has kind of a question about what this looks like internationally. Go ahead, John, ask your question.
Hi there, thanks. Yeah, I just wondered why structural stupidity is being exported to the likes of the UK, where we really perhaps we're more immune to the extremes coming from America, but now with social media and so on, we actually seek to emulate and make it much worse in some ways, particularly at the moment with the leadership contest going on for the Conservatives in the UK.
Yes. Yeah, well, thank you, John. I am very interested in the Anglosphere, that is the English-speaking countries, because what I observed when I got into this in 2015, when American universities began to go insane, was that at the exact same time, Canadian and British universities went insane in exactly the same way. We had all the same stories. So this was not an American export. Usually bad stuff happens in America, and then it takes a year or two to go to Canada and Britain, and it takes a few years to get to Australia and New Zealand. But this happened exactly the same time, in the same way. So you have the same social dynamics because you have the same technologies. And interestingly, social media platforms, because a lot of this stuff is not happening in the Germanic countries. And I believe it's because social media platforms, Facebook, Twitter, and Tumblr, don't respect national boundaries, but they do respect linguistic boundaries. So the English world, we have all similar institutions. We have the same kind of democracy, and the same technology. So we're all suffering the exact same thing. Now, the American political system has this ridiculous, the worst number of political parties to have in a country is 1, but the second worst number is 2. And so in America, we've got 2. And as Lee Drutman has been arguing, I think very persuasively, multi-party systems are just much more resistant to this, the polarization of our psychology is at its maximum when it's us versus them. But if there are 5 parties and you've got to make allies with 2 others to win, you're much more moderate and reasonable. So in some ways, we're all going through the same thing. Some of it is an export. You've got very different racial issues in the UK, but yet that is an export. A lot of our like Ibram Kendi anti-racism has been exported to you, even though it doesn't really work in the UK. But that would be my story.
John, there's a problem. Well, I don't want to.
No, go ahead, Jeff.
All right, to change you may be right about that in the United States, but I don't know how you would get a change from the 2-party system to more, given the incumbent power of the 2 parties and the disproportionate representation of the sparsely populated states. I mean, you're at a point now where 18% of the voters can elect 52% of the Senate, which they're doing as we speak. I don't see those kinds of holds by minority blocks of voters over majority power being given up voluntarily. And I don't see how.
No, they wouldn't be given up. Yeah. So I'm not an expert on that part, but I can say very briefly that I do not want to see third parties with our present first past the post system, because then you get the Ralph Nader effect. You get spoilers. That's why I care so much about final 5 voting or open primaries, because the only way you can get a viable third party candidate is in an open primary system where the person doesn't become a spoiler, where if, even if people were to vote for, say, Andrew Yang or whatever the forward party is going to put, even if you put for him as your first choice, you can still vote for the Democrat or the Republican as your second choice. So I only favor it. I think we do need a third party. Actually, put it this way, I think, as Lee Drutman, I think, has argued, I think what we need is at least 4 parties. If you just have one third party in the middle, what do they stand for? The process. But if you have a center-right party, a center-left party, and a more radical right-left party, now you got real choices and debates within each side. So I think if we had, and Drutman says we had essentially a 4-party system. There was kind of 2 blocks in the Democrats, 2 in the Republicans before. So I'm not an expert on that, but I think there are ways to get there, but not by having like Ross Perot declare, hey, we're a third party running for president. No, please don't do that again.
Well, as someone who worked on that campaign, I might
okay, sorry about that.
differ. No, it's fine. I mean, look, this is the debate, and one of the things I've been following with a lot of interest is, you mentioned this, John, kind of like we need new electoral incentives and structures in order to allow for a healthier market. And I think what the Forward Party is grappling with, they haven't figured this out, but at least they're addressing it, is there a way not to approach this linearly? Can you build a party that's not a traditional third party, that's also focused on reforming the system, even as you're operating in it? I like that. And I think it's one of the reasons why they're getting a very big response. Yeah,
I do too. And we and right, the case for a third party now is so much stronger than it's been in, since the Civil War. So yeah, I wish them luck. I've talked with Andrew several times. I'm a big supporter of him and of the Forward Party. But so yeah, I think it's going to end up having very good effects.
I hope so. That's what I'm hoping. We have a question from Nick Newfield about this recent spate of dollars given by Democrats to far right candidates. Go ahead, Rick. Nick, ask your question. Nick, you still there? I think we might have lost Nick.
Good question, though.
Yeah, I can offer a very brief. I could offer actually a very brief response.
Yeah,
which
go ahead.
Is, if you see democracy as something sacred, and you wouldn't dream of forging a ballot, which is what most Americans think, then it is bizarre and awful to be giving money to bad candidates just to get a strategic advantage because you think they'll be easier to knock off. So it's a horrible thing to do. It's a sacrilegious thing to do if you think that democracy is sacred. But it's a perfect example of what I was talking about before, where if you're highly polarized and you believe that the other side is the Antichrist and will destroy the country, then you think the ends justify the means. You're not going to go to violence just yet, but eventually in many countries, they do go to violence and you try to assassinate your opponents.
Yeah. All right, we have a question from Ben Sylvian about whether it's possible to have a nonprofit social media platform. Go ahead, Ben, ask your question.
Oh, sure. I was just trying to think of ways that we can combat the current profit incentives. It's really challenging to actually, structure a way to, maybe you can avoid an engagement-based model that Twitter has, but can we really pass regulation that will do that? So what sort of actual measures can we put forth that will present a new sort of option as far as social media goes?
Yeah, so I get a couple of emails a week from someone who's designed a new social media platform or a new web browser plugin or something that will foster dialogue or something, and I can't even answer them anymore. But there are several that I think are really good. And so Deb Roy is a professor at the MIT Media Lab, and if you go to ccc.mit.edu, his group at MIT, they are designing such systems. They are expert. They can do these incredibly fancy mathematical computations of systems, but they have created some nonprofit platforms for kids. I think this one's called Clover. I'm looking on the website now. So if you have a nonprofit that is creating a platform on which the kids are the actual customers, and you're trying to actually do something good for them, I think that has a chance of competing, especially if we get a strong national understanding that Facebook, Twitter, and especially Instagram, and well, TikTok is more complicated, but I think TikTok's going to end up being even worse, that these platforms should be seen as, hard drugs, which I'm reluctant to tell adults not to try heroin, but I'll be damned if companies are going to give heroin to my kids. So, if we have a strong national consensus that kids should simply not be posting photos of themselves, girls especially, the evidence really shows girls who go through puberty posting photos of themselves for others to rate, there is no way to make this good. And so if we get a national understanding of that, and we stop our kids from doing that, but we allow them to have other platforms where they have other kinds of social interaction, I think there's a chance, at least for kids. For adults, I think it'll be a little harder.
Just a quick reminder to everybody, if you want to ask a question, put your name and your state in the chat, and then just do a one-sentence overview of what you want to ask, and we'll get it in the queue, and we'll get to you. I want to turn next to former New York City Councilman Sal Albanese, who is leading an effort in New York City to restructure the primary system there. Go ahead.
Great.
Go ahead, Sal.
Hey, John, love your comments. I read your piece along with Catherine, and I know you're a fan of Final Five voting. So we have organized an effort here in New York City with some funding from the Institute to place Final Five voting on the ballot next year.
Fantastic.
Yeah, we would love, obviously, we would love to add your name as an endorser, or
yes, right? You got my endorsement. Add it.
Thank you. And I was wondering, the question I have is, what's your opinion how to best convey this concept to the average voter?
Yeah. It is a little. Yeah. Well, so, we had ranked choice voting in the primary, of course, which Eric Adams ended up winning. And of course, and that was the point of my article with Catherine was, wait, that the general election doesn't matter because all that mattered was the primary. We should have had it not in the primary, but it should have been, in the partisan primary, the Democratic primary, we should have had it as an open primary. That would be Final Five voting. Now, how to convey it, I think there was some confusion early on in implementing, but I think New Yorkers basically got it, and it might take a little time to get used to. But our present system is so bad. So I think part of what you do is you want to say, do you think everyone should get to vote, or do you think that like the minority, people who aren't in the majority don't even get to vote? In New York, Republicans essentially don't get to vote. Like, it just doesn't matter what they do or say. So there are ways to convey the problems of our present system. There are ways to convey. Do you sometimes like more than one candidate? Would you like to be able to show that you actually endorse more than one? So I think there are ways to do it. And people would learn pretty quickly. It's been used in, we do have to look at what has happened in the places where it's introduced. How hard is the learning curve? How can we make it easier? And that is a legitimate problem that we have to be aware of. I just don't know what the confusions have been.
Yeah, we're connecting with those people around the country for feedback and advice. So thank you.
Great.
I appreciate your comments.
Thank you.
I would just add, Sal, my 2 cents on that question is we can't be nerds. We've got to connect with people and talk about this as an issue of voter empowerment and in fairness, and not live in the technical weeds of this stuff. We need to connect emotionally with people about the state of our democracy, both in New York City and nationally. And
Couldn't agree more.
I think that. All right, I'm going to do an experiment here, and it's probably going to fail. So please forgive me in advance. But I want to ask Jan Wooten and Kathy Stewart to both ask a question of you, John, that has to do with the whole issue of what is persuasion, what are some new forms of cultural ways of connecting politically. So I want them both to ask the question and then have you answer. So why don't you go first, Jan, and then Kathy, you go second, and then we'll see if this works.
Okay.
Hey, don't know if I'm trying to be persuasive on this or not, but I am wondering, you mentioned John Stuart Mills and you've mentioned a lot of classics that we all need to go refresh on. But I'm thinking that in this 21st century where we're kind of grappling with, perhaps the end of the fact as we once knew it, and maybe some other ways of creating our political discourse, that maybe we need to think about another way of pointing to persuasion. Or could it be that it's less about winning people over to a position rather than somehow creating something new with the other, and maybe the more diverse, the better. So I'm throwing that in for consideration.
Okay, to build on that, and thanks, Jan, and thanks everybody for a really very rich, very challenging conversation. I'm vice president at Independent Voting, so we work with that huge community of voters across the political spectrum who have decided to disaffiliate. I think it's an act of non-compliance with the current political culture. So kind of building on what Jan's raising, about perhaps a new approach to what persuasion is, I think we have to come up with new cultural institutions that actually, even as we work to reform in some of the ways that you're describing, the way social media has taken off and perpetuates some very dangerous political culture and just general cultural shutting of doors and fear. And I think that part of what I've seen in working in the independent voter community is a real hunger for that, because independents are so diverse, but they're independent. And they also have faced so many obstacles, and they tend to kind of look for diverse news sources, as John was referencing the study done out of Arizona. And I would add here, the thing I'm most interested in the Forward Party is they're attempting to do something that I think could be very important in this way. They're attempting to bring together people that come from all parts of the spectrum. As I've heard David Jolly say, he's saying, if you're too ideologically wed, which I think is part of what social media drives at us, there's only one way, right? It's left, it's right, and everything else is evil, and the other side is evil. So they're looking to build a new kind of political culture. But so that's what I was going to ask you. How do you think about the political cultural issues, even as we have to work on the political structural reforms and reforming our social media?
Yeah, no, thank you. Those are two excellent questions, and I see why John
Right,
put
so the
them
experiment
together.
work.
Yes, it did. So I just put in the chat. So I'm working on a document with I'm part of Fix Us, fixusnow.org, run by Maya McGinnis and Mickey Edwards and John Avlon. A group of people are in it. And I just put the link in the chat. I hope everybody will click on that and go to this document, because there are all these ideas for reform out there, and my head was spinning. I could not keep them all straight. And what's the research on them? Who knows? So I led the group to create this document. So if you go there, there's a little introduction. We make the case democracy is declining around the world since about 2015, 2016. And if you look on beginning on page 3, there's a table of contents. And we've broken it up into 6 reform imperatives. There's 6 different things we need to do to address this crisis. Improve democratic institutions, improve epistemic institutions like universities and journalism, reform social media, those we've talked about. Number 4 is prepare the next generation for life in this polarized democracy. Number 5 is a more inclusive economy. And number 6 is what we're talking about here, a more centripetal culture. So if you remember from high school physics, centrifugal force is what, if you spin around, the force blowing it outward, if kids are running in a circle with a hand around a pole, they're running, it pulls them outward, it breaks it apart. Centripetal force is what pulls them inward. America, our founding imperative is e pluribus unum. Now that's very, very hard to do, to make one out of many. It's very hard to do. And most countries that have tried it have failed. As Yasha Monk has observed, there are democracies in the past, but none of them are multi-ethnic. There are multi-ethnic societies in the past, but none of them are democracies. So multi-ethnic democracy is very, very hard to do. Clearly, it can be done. We've done it. And we were making such progress from the 1960s through the early 2010s, so much progress. And now that's reversing, I believe. So we need a more centripetal culture. And my guiding light here is the sociologist Emil Durkheim. He's the greatest social scientist of all time. He's one of the greatest thinkers of all time. Durkheim talked about the need for communion, for being part of a larger whole. All human societies have rituals where they come together. Usually they move in synchrony, they dance or they beat drums. The group comes together at least once a year, but it's often usually more than that. They come together and that creates the polity, that creates them as a group. Now we can't do that anymore. It used to be that at least we all watched the same news at the same time, and we went shopping at the same time, and we didn't go shopping on Sunday. So at least we were on the same schedule, and we had the same sporting events, and we had the same story about America. So we used to have a lot in common. The post-war world was this period of incredible centripetal force communion. Now, some people were excluded early, but the 50 years of incredible progress of integration, I mean, we should celebrate that and say, let's do more of that. So things are coming apart. People are lonely, and the more time they spend on social media, the more lonely they are, because social media doesn't let you connect. It lets you perform at other people. And that's a very lonely life. That's destroying our girls. The girls are so depressed because they don't get to connect. They're just working on Instagram all day long. Let's see, did the document not work? Oh no, it's okay. So anyway, to answer the questions, I think what we're suffering from is a complete starvation, a drought of connection and communion. Persuasion takes place within relationships. It's very hard to persuade at people. It's very hard to persuade people who you don't know just by giving them reasons, especially when there are strong emotions. So I think we have to rethink. Someday we'll figure out how these new technologies can be beneficial in creating communities and in creating effective persuasion. I do believe that's possible, and I think we'll get there eventually. But for now, the engagement-based companies, the platforms that we have for now, are just devastating us. They're making it very hard for us to connect, commune, or have democracy.
Well, it seems to me one of the things that the tech utopians didn't quite think through, or they did a bait and switch, was selling us that connection is the same thing as communion.
Exactly.
And they're not the same thing.
They're not the same thing. That's right. And just to make one brief point about the tech founders, I work in a business school. I study corporate culture. These companies have cultures. Google was founded with an ethical culture. You can criticize it on certain decisions, but it has a culture very different from Facebook. Facebook, if you read any of the biographies of Mark Zuckerberg, Facebook was founded by a guy whose only imperative was growth. He didn't give a damn about privacy. The famous quote from him in college, well, Mark, why do people give you all this data? And he says, stupid fucks, they trust me. Or they trust me, stupid fucks, is what he said. And so Facebook has had an unethical culture from the beginning and an absolute imperative for growth. That's all that matters is growth. And it shows.
We've got just a few more minutes here, and I want to go to Pedro Silva in Colorado, who has, in my mind, an extremely thought-provoking question about what is worth knowing. Go ahead, Pedro. Pedro. I can't.
Yeah.
Oh, you're there. Okay, good. Go ahead. Ask your question.
So yeah, I just wanted to ask about how do people determine what is worth knowing? Because typically speaking, people tend to use a safety in numbers mentality when trying to determine what is worth knowing. And with us living in what we call a knowledge economy and people being afraid of not knowing, I think we need better ways of discerning. So how do we help people do that from a healthy individual standpoint, as opposed to going through the mobocracy, which is a term I just learned recently, way of approaching information?
No, that's right. No, that's a great question. So I'm a social psychologist, which means I study how it is that we influence each other. We don't just say, what should I know? Let me go learn what I need to know. You know, if you're fixing your car, you'll look up what's wrong with the carburetor. But in terms of political, social stuff, which doesn't really directly impact your life, how do you stay in the know? If you're not in the know, you lose prestige, you look foolish. So certainly from the time kids are 7 or 8, they begin to get a sense of what are people talking about? What do I need to do to fit into this group? So that's always been the case. And when knowledge was mediated, when knowledge came to us from newspapers, television, there were people who sort of decided, there were editors who decided what's most important, what goes above the fold in the printed newspaper. So that was a clear sign about what's important to know. And then you can make your judgments within that. And my argument is that everything got shredded in the early 2010s when people stopped going. They don't even go to the New York Times website by the 2010s. They get the links on Facebook. So once everything runs through the platforms, now people aren't really looking to the editors, they're looking to other people. And who are those other people? It's not a representative group of fellow humans. It's the people who are putting huge amounts of stuff out there in the catchiest way. The people who are best at making memes, they're now the ones who are most influential. So memes tend to crush truth every time. People are highly socially suggestible, and social media hooks us up to make us maximally socially suggestible and subject to mob dynamics, as you say. So, you know, this is like what happened when the printing press came in and upended the old order of information. And it took a couple hundred years and a lot of wars to get to a point where we all recognize the printing press as a fantastic innovation. The same, I think, is likely to be true with the internet, although it won't take a few centuries, but I think it'll take a few decades.
Okay, thanks. Well, I was a pastor for a long time, and I used your information in a lot of my sermons.
Oh,
so
the righteous
thanks.
mind. Yeah, I hear it is helpful because, right, as a pastor, you know, my rabbi at the synagogue in New York, if she says anything about Israel, half the congregation is going to get mad at her. So, you know, you have to learn to walk a fine line and understand everyone's motivations.
Yeah, thanks.
All right, we have time for just one more question, and I really apologize to the dozens of people that we're just not going to be able to field all of them today. Thank you for taking the time. I want to go to Bob Stefanowski in Connecticut, he's actually running for governor and has some questions. So go ahead, Bob.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. Connecticut is interesting, where it's the largest party by a factor of 2 is unaffiliate. I'm running for governor against a Democratic incumbent in October. And my question is, I would love to open up primaries to unaffiliates, given it's the biggest party. How do you protect, given some of the things, it just happens to be Democrats, I'm not trying to be judgmental in terms of them advertising for a primary candidate that they want to win because they're more competitive. If you open it up to an open primary, are there any methods to prevent that kind of that behavior from happening, to have it still be a legitimate and objective process?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't have an answer there. I would actually send it back to John, who's thought about that much more. You know, I would just say that if you have ranked choice vote, if you have final 5 voting, you know, then even though you could, you know, anyone can, if people put a lot of money behind a candidate, they could certainly get some nobody or somebody who has a name like a TV star. They can get them in the first round when voting will still be relatively low. But you know, my hope is that at least in this final round, people are paying a lot more attention. But John, do you have an answer to that question?
Yeah, I mean, I think that as long as primaries are controlled by the parties, and what you're doing on primary day is selecting a nominee for a Democratic or Republican party, that kind of manipulation, there's just no way to eliminate it. It's going to be rampant. It's going to happen. The big switch is when you move from party primaries to nonpartisan primaries, whether it's top 2, as in California, Nebraska, and Washington, top 4, Alaska, top 5, which we're going to be voting on in Nevada. this year and hopefully New York City next year. When you get rid of the party control of the primaries, all that kind of manipulation changes because the voters are not saying, who do I want to be the Republican nominee? They're saying, which candidates do I like and want to be in the general election? And so that kind of manipulation goes away.
Great, thank you very much.
All right, we have to wrap. John, do you want to give a quick plug about your organization, Constructive Dialogue?
Yes.
Tell us about it.
Yes. So I founded Heterodox Academy originally to promote viewpoint diversity in universities, and we created a program called Open Mind originally to teach students how to talk across divides, how to understand why it's so hard, how to understand moral psychology, left versus right. So we recently changed our name. It's called Constructive Dialogue. If you go to constructivedialogue.org, I'll just put that in the chat. This is a program. It's free to use. Of course, we hope that institutions will pay us for it. We need to pay our salaries, but especially if you are a high school teacher or college teacher, or if you are in any organization that's having structural stupidity problems, that is, people are afraid to speak up, there's a lot of internal conflict, give this a try. It really works. It really helps people. And again, as Rich was talking about the need for both courage and humility, give this to your group. It's about 8 30-minute lessons. So you do it over a couple of weeks, you talk about it, and I can almost guarantee you'll have better discussions. People will feel more open and trusting. Things will work better.
That's great. Thank you. Just a couple quick announcements. We have 2 great virtual discussions coming up after Labor Day. We're going to be talking with Jackie Salett and Tom Riley, who have founded the new Center for Independent and Sustainable Democracy at ASU, and they have a new book coming out called The Independent Voter. We're also going to be talking with Joe Bresney and some of the leaders of the Nevada Final Five campaign, which again is going to be on the ballot this November. We're going to talk to them and kind of create a national discussion about ways that people can support that effort regardless of where they live. So lots of things coming down the pike. It's going to be a very busy fall for the open primaries community and the political reform community. Jeff, any final words before we sign off here?
No, thanks. It was a good discussion. Thanks for including me.
No, thank you for bringing your years of experience in this arena to bear. Thank you, John, for taking the time. Thank all of you for coming. You'll be getting a follow-up email with us with a video of this, so you can share it with people that weren't able to be a part of the conversation. And have a great day. Thanks so much.
Thank you, John. Thank you, everyone.
Take care.